Hello and welcome to the webinar, Recognizing and Presenting Student Learning in the 21st Century. This webinar is brought to you by Aaeebl, the Center for Recorded Achievement, and Epac. I'm John Idelson from Epac, and I'm doing a little bit of housekeeping here. We want you to be sure to enter your name in the chat area and let you know that we will be recording this session, and recordings of this and the chat transcript will be made available on our respective organizational websites after the webinar. I want to particularly thank those people who are presenting for us today: Helen, Kathy, Rob, Trish, and Dave. We have an agenda here. We'll try to stick to it closely. So if you want to move ahead to a certain session, this is the hopeful timeline that we'll be doing. We also would like everyone in the chat area to fill out this audience poll, giving us your name, your institution, and answering this question about your involvement in this topic. But to not take time away from our presenters, let's go to our first presenter, Helen Chin.
Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We're so delighted that you were able to join us today. Before we actually begin, I'd like to just, provide a welcome from Aaeebl, the Association for Authentic Experiential Evidence-Based Learning, as well as the Epac ePortfolio Community of Practice. Both Rob and I have been talking about the idea of this webinar for probably a year now, and so we're so delighted to be able to put this together and have you join us today. Both Rob and I are on the board of Aaeebl, and John and I are the co-moderators of Epac. Before we go forward, I'd like to go ahead and just turn it over to Rob to say a few words about our other partner in this, the Center for Recording Achievement.
Thank you very much, Helen. And just to echo, our delight we've finally made it to this point, and that so many people are joining us. And this is clearly a topic that people want to talk about from a variety of perspectives. Great. Just 3 points really about the CRA by way of introduction. One is just to say we're a charity, a network, a collaborative organization, increasingly, as you might expect, working collaboratively with Aaeebl, and we're now working on a reciprocal membership model so that people who are Aaeebl members can get involved in CRA stuff and vice versa. We've also been involved in the Euro Portfolio project, and there are some people from that project participating today, which is great because that spreads the reach. And finally, for this bit, we designed and implemented the trial process for the Higher Education Achievement Report in the UK, and we'll be coming to that later. But just for now, I'll hand back to Helen, who can talk to us about stuff your side of the pond. Thank you very much, folks.
Great, thank you, Rob. So if we go to the next slide, please. I guess what I'll go ahead and start with is actually some overall framing of some of the conversations that have been happening here in the United States around thinking about our traditional records of student learning. When students graduate from our institutions, they certainly leave with two official documents of their education. One, the diploma, which they might, put in a frame and hang on the wall of their office, and the second being the academic transcript. But increasingly, we know that transcripts are very limited in their usefulness. This article from the Chronicle of Higher Education actually says, we have almost no useful information about what students learn from school, in the college transcript. On the next slide, this question about, transcripts as a record of learning, the diploma. What does a college degree really tell employers about how much an applicant knows and about how much they learned to earn that credential? If we go to the next slide, this article, which actually features an interview with my university registrar, Tom Black, Tom actually calls the transcript as a record of everything the student has forgotten. And so people usually chuckle when he makes that comment, but as a longstanding registrar of over 30 years, Tom actually speaks with credibility and authority when he talks about sort of the limited usefulness as well as the challenges of the current academic transcript. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we actually participated in a project that was called the Comprehensive Student Record Project, and it was co-sponsored by the Association of American Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, and we're delighted to have Tom Green from ACRO here, with us. NASFA, of Student Affairs Professionals, really representing the co-curricular and extracurricular activities, and the project itself was funded by the Lumina Foundation. This is a list of the 12 institutions that were participating in the Comprehensive Student Record Project, and Stanford, as well as IUPUI, and again, we're delighted to have Kathy Boyarsky from IUPUI here as well in this webinar. And if you go to this website, hosted hosted by Acro, you can actually see different profiles of each of these projects. What was really interesting about the Acro-NASPA partnership is that it was a partnership between the registrars, those who keep the records, as well as student affairs, not so much academic affairs, at least in this initial pass. And it was an opportunity to really struggle and address the question of how do we measure and capture, document, the co-curricular, extracurricular experiences. If we go to the next slide, there was a convening at the end of this project in Indianapolis, trying to look at beyond the transcript and really representing and really facilitating this national conversation around, around records, around representations of student learning, around badges, all the things that sort of were mentioned in the poll. These things are coming up. And that's part of the reason why Rob and I wanted to provide a platform for those who are interested in these kinds of questions and issues from both the UK, the US, and really, quite frankly, around the world, given the diversity of the registrants for today's webinar, an opportunity to be able to exchange some ideas and questions about this very issue. Another project that, that might be of interest on the next slide is actually a project that was led by a faculty member, Professor Mitchell Stevens, in the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford, about responsible use of student data and in higher education. And so this website is another one that you can take a look at. Tom and I actually had the opportunity to be able to facilitate a track in this convening that took place last June on representation. And that is sort of how we're framing the work that we're doing now, is under the broad concept of how do we represent student learning, which is also the theme of today's webinar. The idea that on one hand, we know that students have a rich experience, at our institutions, in our programs, and so on. And in many ways, the evidence of their learning is embodied in themselves, in the students themselves. However, what we're trying to do with some of our work at Stanford, as well as, in the other projects in the Comprehensive Student Record Initiative, is actually how do we create representations of student learning that more accurately and comprehensively represent the learning that is happening. What this really comes down to, if we go to the next slide, is a question of value. What is the value of the representation? And again, typically the representations have been academic transcripts, diplomas, and so on, in a format that is typically paper. But now that we have technology advancements that allow us to create digital representations, what does that mean? And the other question, of course, is value to whom? Value to employers, values to students themselves, value to other institutions, value that we can communicate to families, to parents, to funders, to policymakers. So if we go to the next slide, now I'm going to actually transition to our work here at Stanford. At Stanford, actually, we're interested in the intersection between the academic transcript, the official record, as well as an e-portfolio, something that is more student-centered, that might include reflect the representation of students' learning as they've lived and experienced it. And the particular project on the next slide that I'd like to share with you is a program called the Notation in Science Communication. This is an undergraduate program that is focused on providing students who are interested in developing additional competency in science communication an opportunity to be able to take some additional courses. But in designing this program, it wasn't just taking courses. What students actually submit that earns them the notation is actually a portfolio of 10 to 15 artifacts that represent their evidence of their competency in science communication. So if we go to the next slide, this is what the representation of that or the recognition of that experience looks like. So students who earn the notation, they actually get a paper certificate. And the paper certificate, you'll see here, carries the Stanford seal. And that's because it has been approved by our faculty senate. We have certainly many other certificates that don't go through the faculty senate academic process and so on, but this one does. And as a result, this notation is listed, is noted on the academic transcript. If you notice in the upper right-hand corner, there is an ID, and that ID actually can be entered into a registrar website, registrar-hosted website. And so if we go to the next slide, we can actually see what that validation page looks like. So again, the ID gets entered into a registrar-hosted website, a validation page comes up, it actually immediately verifies that this particular student was awarded this particular notation on the date, and so on. And then it also has an additional description of what that program was about. Because certainly if you were an employer, let's say, and you got a certificate that said this student got a notation in science communication, you could probably guess what it sort of referred to, but you wouldn't necessarily know the details. So in this case, it has an official description of the program, in addition to program learning outcomes, as well as the courses that we're taking and the learning outcomes for each of those courses. Now, the opportunity here that that we collaborate on with the notation folks on is actually the development of this portfolio and being able to create a closer connection between the portfolio of evidence and the actual record. So you can see here there's a link to the student portfolio, and if you go to the next slide, you can actually see a sort of a page that has some additional metadata. So what happened was that we were able to take the portfolio that students created in our portfolio platform, export it out of the portfolio platform into a zip file, and then actually upload it in the Stanford Digital Repository, which is hosted by our libraries. I will say our library has been a critical partner in this, and the idea is that they know how to archive artifacts, archive multimedia, archive student work. And so within the, on this page in the digital repository, there's the appropriate metadata. And then what's also generated is a permanent URL. And that permanent URL can then be, linked to the record, linked to the resume, linked to LinkedIn, and so on. So if we go to the next page, we can see actually, this is actually the portfolio as it was created, just some screenshots. And the idea is that in uploading it and archiving it in the library, it wasn't just going to be a file folder with 15 PDFs, that it actually was, that we want to preserve the actual portfolio itself as it was created by the student. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Kathy Biarski at IUPUI, to share her experience in the Comprehensive Student Record Project.
Is she muted or?
Oh, Kathy, I think you might be muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. So sorry. So a little bit about IUPUI. We're an urban commuter institution. We have, unlike a lot of urban commuter institutions, however, we have a majority of traditional age students who are having lots of experiences in and out of the classroom. And we've, as an institution, put considerable effort into developing a fully fledged division of student affairs with lots of co-curricular engagement. We also have codified the high impact practices under the acronym RISE, standing for Research, International Study, Service Learning, and Experiential Learning, including internships and practicum, those kinds of experiences. So those are priorities on our campus and for our students to enhance their classroom learning. So our involvement in the Comprehensive Record Project came at a perfect time for us to start to think about, while we're expanding these opportunities, how can we also make them part of the record of student learning? So on the next slide, you can see that our group, we had a committee, and we started out by naming some guiding principles. First and foremost, we wanted this to be a true academic and student affairs partnership. We were absolutely looking to record the whole experience a student was having both in and out of the classroom. The achievement record, as we started to talk about it before we had a name, we were very clear that what went on that record had to reflect learning experiences that were associated with specific learning outcomes, rubrics, and a process for that learning to be verified. So a student couldn't list that they were a member of a student organization or president without having that be associated with some learning outcomes and having that be verified. We at IUPUI, our general education outcomes are titled The Principles of Undergraduate Learning, and we have an associated set of co-curricular learning outcomes, and those are the learning outcomes that the experiences on the record need to be based upon. Again, everything had to be verifiable, and because we were looking at external audiences and those calls that have for more information, ease of finding information about student learning that Helen had pointed to in the articles, we wanted it to be graphically engaging and pleasing and easy to find information. So on the next slide, you can see a mock-up of where we're at. Now, this is not the most recent mock-up of this. We're working on it on an updated one. We actually have landed on the title, we're calling it REAL, R-E-A-L, the Record of Experiential and Applied Learning. You can see that across the top, we have 6 categories that represent outcomes and priorities and the high impact practices that we have codified at IUPUI. So there's a format there for putting the additional notations on the record. There's an organizing principle for all of them. And then it goes across time, so you can see a student's progression of their involvement. We do have processes either through committees or through an established center on campus, where in each of the 6 buckets, if you will, of achievements, there's a process for the experiences to be verified, either if it's associated with a course, and the course has a notation on the transcript, and it has an additional notation saying, for example, the student is conducting service in the course, or if a student is involved in community service outside of a course, there's a process for them to apply to get that service, those service hours documented on the record of experiential and applied learning. So this is where we're at right now. We have, throughout the process of this, developing this, started to talk about the role of e-portfolios, because while this provides an enriched picture of what students have been involved in, it still doesn't give an employer or a graduate school committee a view of what the student has actually done, or the really powerful student narrative that can be found in a portfolio. We are still having those conversations, but on the next slide, you can see some of the things that we have started to discuss around including e-portfolios on the record. So the first issue or challenge is that because this is an official university document, everything needs to be verified in order to have that stamp from the registrar. But we know that students develop portfolios on their own. They also develop portfolios through non-verified experiences. And what happens to those? Those are very powerful. They tell a lot about a student, but right now we don't have a process for putting those on the real document. And so we'll have to think through that. We've also talked about that if this goes on the student record, and we keep in mind external audiences, one of the things we know about e-portfolios and good e-portfolio pedagogy is the more the student can customize the portfolio in order to make and organize their experiences in a way that makes sense to them and tells their story, that's good pedagogy. But an employer is not necessarily going to want to weed through and find the information that's relevant to them if every student has a different context or different organizations and different kinds of content to that portfolio. So there's a rub there between establishing a common format for an external audience versus what we know is good pedagogy in allowing students to have ownership over the way that their portfolio is created. We also talk a bit about kind of taking that one step further, is that if we are developing portfolios for if a portfolio is going to be on a record for an external audience, that often portfolios on a campus are used in a course or in an experience like study abroad, where the goal is the audience is not external. The audience is the student themselves and their own thinking about what they've experienced. And so the content may not be suitable for an external audience. And what is the institution's responsibility, or how would we build capacity to really help students develop a portfolio that can go on their record that is appropriate for an external audience, a different audience than the audience for whom they probably created that portfolio. So again, while we've developed a more comprehensive record, if you will, to show students learning on our campus, we're still really wrestling with the role of e-portfolios and how we can roll that into established good practice for student transcripts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rob to tell us about his experiences in the UK.
Thanks ever so much, Kathy. Double thanks, because Kathy and I have now done 2 virtual contributions together, because Kathy was involved in our Edinburgh conference, and we haven't yet managed to meet. So that's one of the things we ought to try and rectify. Good evening, colleagues from the UK, where it's a wonderful evening, which is not often you can say that in the northwest of England, but tonight it is. Couple of points just by setting off. Excuse me. We're giving you a lot of stuff to think about today, and I would encourage people to use the chat as a way of identifying things you want to come back to. We can't come back to them all tonight, but I think we're interested in seeing this as a primer to take forward some of these conversations. And actually, the good news for my bit of this is I'm really here as the warm-up person for Trish and for David, who will give you some perspectives on UK practice. And I was just thinking, as people were talking, as Kathy and Helen were talking, about the sort of question why are we doing this? And it seems to me there's a lot of common ground potentially, and that common ground is around helping students make the most of their higher education experience. That's pretty important in the current model. In the UK context, and maybe in the US and other contexts, it's about helping students take some responsibility and control for charting their way through that experience. We have some concerns, I have some concerns, just speak personally, about the idea of student as customer. And I'd like to see them as much more active agents in that kind of process. Clearly, we're talking about the notion of life-wide learning. You're talking about that too. Documenting that achievement profile, help students reflect and plan in relation to that, and also make use of it, as Kathy's just been talking about, in that sense of progression from HE, and how do we manage that in an increasingly competitive graduate labour market, certainly in the UK. So that's my kind of starting point, none of which I'd written down before Kathy and Helen spoke, so that's probably messed up my time allocation completely. Next slide, please. I'm going to do 10 years in under 10 minutes because that's how long this has been going on. There was a gentleman called Ron Deering, Sir Ron Deering in the UK, later Lord Deering, who produced a report in 1998, and he was heard to say, in the UK, it takes higher education 10 years to really get stuff implemented. I don't know whether that's true in the US, but we've had our 10 years. Starting point then, a UK government white paper. Interestingly, in the context of the conversations we've heard from Kathy and Helen, look at the stakeholders, the student, institutions, employers, and others. So we, like you, are thinking about multiple stakeholders in this world. And that led to a working group chaired by, as he is now, Professor Sir Robert Burgess, who was then Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leicester. And for some reason, we got involved in that. And some work was done to scope the territory. And in 2007, we produced some proposals, and 3 of them are here. The first one's a rather grand idea. It will be the central vehicle for recording all university student achievement in all institutions. So not too much by way of, minimizing the impact there. I'll say a bit about where we're up to with that. The idea that the Higher Education Achievement Report would incorporate the European Diploma Supplement, similar to the Australian Graduation Statement. So it would have that academic record at the centre. But that academic record, the important thing there is that while it is academic, we've been making attempts to translate out of academic ease into what people have been calling plain English, because we're thinking about other audiences. And then that other bit, that life-wide non-formal learning element, and we had 3 categories in our original thinking that we might split that kind of data into. Prizes, university prizes, quite well documented already. Non-academic awards around employability or social engagement, public engagement, again, pretty well established. And then there was another category called anything else the university wanted to verify. That's been great fun. It's been really interesting because that's where the issues come up, and that's still a work in progress. So we had some pilot projects, testing feasibility, and a recommendation to the UK HE sector to implement the HERE in 2012. Note the word recommendation. There are no HERE police. It's not a requirement that UK higher education institutions do this. What there is a technical specification, and we have a number of the vendors that are involved in implementing the HERE with institutions on the webinar tonight. So there's a technical specification, an XML spec, and there's a HERE reference pack. There's guidance to institutions, but nobody will come calling and say you're doing it wrong. And within the HERE family, we have about 100 institutions who have implemented or are working to implement so far, and that's around 2/3 of the UK HE sector. Next slide, please, colleagues. Okay, so we've had 10 years, getting it on for 10 years of pilot work, implementation work. There are some people on the call who've been centrally involved in that, and it's great for them to join this. And I just wanted to identify a few points that we've picked up on the way. Some of them have already been picked up. Helen picked up the paper to digital dimension, and maybe also that Kathy picked up the idea that HERE data is data. How you configure that for audience is something we need to be working on as well. I think that there is a common document, but students may want to display different bits of data for different purposes, and we're talking about that, but not very far with it, I suspect. Equally, we've been talking about moving from an exit document, which was the first pilot scheme. Can we actually do this here? Can technical systems produce it? Can institutions embrace it? To the idea of the HERE as a developing reference point for students to think about their university experience, their progress, their achievements, their developing trajectory, their thinking about what to do next. That notion, which we've talked about and we'll come to in a minute, which is built on the personal development planning paradigm in the UK. And we've moved away from seeing the HERE as a freestanding initiative, and it's been evident in your thinking too, to connectivity. How does HERE data, a university verified document made available digitally, connect to other technological innovations? And we've listed 3 here. Portfolios and digital badges have been mentioned. Learner analytics are part of our thinking too. And last but not least, how does the HERE make sense in the thinking of an institution? Because there are all sorts of things coming at us thick and fast from government and from other agencies, and this has to survive as part of an institutional strategy and a set of institutional thoughts. So this is still a work in progress, colleagues, and you can see some of the things we're trying to connect to. Technology, value that wider student experience. re-energizing tutorial support in the US to get academic advising as part of that sense of catalytic and formative use of the here evidence, and clearly connecting with institutional strategies, with student retention, student employability. Next slide, please. Okay, 3 final perspectives and then a picture of some people jumping into some water, and then I'm gone. These are from institutions that are not on the call, but just to give you a flavour of some of the institutional thinking. And this is about educational value. Kathy talked about that. It's also about connecting to employability. How do we help students think ahead, look ahead, recognizing what they are doing is actually got some value in terms of how they present themselves to others at a later point. Next slide, please. This one identifies an institution because they couldn't do it any other way. This is the University of Manchester in the UK. Manchester is an intensely research-intensive institution, the place where they worked and discovered graphene, if you're into this kind of territory. And Manchester are doing a lot of work to make sure here fits into their strategy. And look at the categories we've got. That notion of volunteering, making a difference for students, that notion not only of cataloging success, but also thinking about academic advice and progression, having discussions around that, demonstrating achievements, but also thinking about what comes next. So all of that stuff around supporting students' engagement. And clearly also trying to help students articulate their distinctiveness. In the 1980s, as far ago as that, when we did some work in universities, the first generation of employability-related projects, one of the documents said, so you have a degree, so what? So are all the other people have a degree. How you can make that different to you, to others, is really key. Next slide, please. And that takes us to that notion of student engagement. This is a third institution talking about how they're using the here as a reference point. Tutors and academic advisors supporting planning and reflection, making the students at the centre in terms of managing their career. And I suspect that all those are processes that other people are interested in too. And it's a question of how the data has that purpose, which isn't simply representing the student to someone else. It's also, as Kathy said, representing the student back to themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, and that's my cue to hand on to Trish initially, and then to David, who'll give you a couple of institutional perspectives from the UK. With that, over to Trish, who will talk to you from just up the road, the University of Liverpool. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Rob, and hello to everybody wherever you are. My name is Trish Lunt, and I'm based at the Centre for Lifelong Learning at Liverpool University, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what's been happening at Liverpool University for the last 2 or 3 years, particularly with regard to our thinking behind recognising and presenting student learning for co- and extracurricular activities in particular, but how that links into the overall here developments that Rob has just been talking about. So if we move to the next slide, please. There's been 3 different phases to this development. I'm going to introduce them all briefly, then just spend a little bit of time on each one, just saying a little bit more. About 3 years ago, the first thing we needed was an updated web portal. We had some static websites which promoted a range of co- and extracurricular activity, but to be honest, that wasn't where students were. We needed something more interactive. So that was what we did. We introduced that, and we wanted to develop a one-stop shop where students could log on and find out what else is there out there to supplement my student experience. So that was introduced in 2014. And then we wanted to take that one stage on with the message. So the introductory message was, there's lots of things, come to Liverpool, you can have a great time, you can join in, you can make friends. But then we wanted to develop the next message into, did you realise while you were doing all these great things, you're developing skills, you're developing academic skills, you're developing employability skills. So how can we help you identify those activities and help you to reflect on and recognise the skills that you're gaining through those activities? And then finally, as Rob has outlined, how can we take that information forward so you can have recognition on the Higher Education Achievement Report. So that was our 3-stage process. I'm just going to say a little bit more now about some of the key features behind each of those. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So the first phase, as it mentioned, was a web-based signposting resource to promote the range of activities that the university and the Guild had to offer. It was very important to us that it was available not just to current students, but also prospective students, but also that alumni could continue to look, and perhaps maybe that would be a way of keeping them engaged in Liverpool. There'd be opportunities to keep them involved as well. It was also particularly important that when we designed this site, we took account of the needs of different student groups. Undergraduate students, taught PGT, part-time PGT students, postgraduate research students. We wanted something that would be inclusive to all of those groups, and that was something that informed our thinking about developing the site so that it looked individual and tailored to these student groups as much as possible. So if we go to the next slide, please. I haven't got time in this particular webinar to take you through the portal, but the link on the slide you can have a look at a little bit later if you'd like to. I'd just like to highlight just some of the key features that we designed into the portal so that I hope you can see the start of the pedagogic process that we tried to put into place. You might hopefully be able to see the pink login circle, the top right-hand side. That is there so any current student of the university can log into the portal. You don't have to log in, but we find the majority of students do. And what that means is when the results are returned, if they're looking for, activities associated with music or whatever, if they're using the open keyword search, it will deliberately highlight for them those activities that have been put on for them by their department. We know that student engagement research highlights the value of co-curricular opportunities being available to students and the sense of belongingness and satisfaction that students get by taking part in co-curricular activities with other students and perhaps with staff. So that login button allows the system to recognise the students and flag which activities have been organised especially for them by the department, but also, of course, any other related activities related to their search results that are happening in the university. So that was one element. We also thought, and we talked a lot to undergraduate students and postgraduate students taught and research about how they might use such a site. And these were the messages that we got from the students. A number of new students to the university, whether they're PGT, PGR or undergraduate, wanted to know what was happening socially, how they could integrate, how they could get to know Liverpool, how they could make friends. So we set up a basis of social activity. The skill development was our soft introduction to flagging the employability and skills, because we had students from perhaps second and third year undergraduates, students from PGTs, who perhaps had had a conversation with a careers advisor and recognised that they might need to do more to develop certain sets of skills. So another way into the database was to search on the skill development, and we used the same skills framework that underpins the curricular skills framework. So again, recognition by students across the curricular and co and extracurricular. The More Opportunities tag, it's not a very interesting name, but we couldn't think of anything better, was basically activities that might not immediately be thought of as social or skill development. So it might be an open lecture series that you might look at there, but other things that you might want to get involved in. And of course, all of the activities can be tagged to as many of those categories as might be appropriate. So it's very basic and simple, and that's exactly how we wanted it, particularly when we talk to students for whom English is not their first language. We had to get a site that was simple, intuitive to use for anybody who was using the site. A couple of other things just to mention by way of moving on, which I'll do in a moment. The particular activities that are on the database, as well as being tagged with who's organised them and which categories, there's also a little S button, a skills button, which if you hover over it, it will highlight to the students the opportunities that are available for developing certain skills through participation in that activity. It also flags if activities can be recognised on the here, and I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. So on the next slide, please. So we've had the portfolio, we've had the, here's lots of things to do, we'll help you join in, we'll encourage you to join in, and then, you know, soft introduction to recognising the skills. So with the Liverpool e-portfolio, what we did, we worked with colleagues here from Epac Learning through their e-portfolio system, which is called Epac. And what we did was develop, integrated into our student record system in the university, an e-portfolio system, which, as I mentioned, is in Epac, where every single university student has their own e-portfolio. And I'm mentioning it in 30 seconds, but I'm talking months and months of work with colleagues from Epac and colleagues from the university to integrate that. What goes into the e-portfolio is activities which have been institutionally verified, and those will be some of the activities from the My Liverpool portal, co- and extracurricular activities which meet the institutional criteria for inclusion on the Higher Education Achievement Report. So we've put criteria in, as every university has, as Rob was saying a little bit earlier. The reason that we did that is that we recognise that the e-portfolio could get very busy if you put every single individual activity in of a 45-minute talk there and a 45-minute talk there. So we didn't want perhaps smaller activities appearing on the Higher Education Achievement Report, but something that was a substantial demonstration of learning that would mean something to employers and also mean something to students. So there is a panel that approves certain activities as meeting the criteria for inclusion on our here. And those activities are added to the e-portfolios in Epac. Now, one decision that we did take, we said, well, we could let the students add their own information into Epac, but we know with the best will in the world that perhaps, you know, a lot of students may not have engaged with that as fully as we would have perhaps hoped. So what we've actually done is that the information that's added into the student e-portfolios, the vast majority of activities organised by the university or the guild, they are added into the portfolio by the member of staff who is organising that activity. But we do have, as Kathy was saying a little bit earlier, an opportunity for students who've done activities not organised by the university or the guild to write a protocol statement and to get that verified by somebody external and somebody in the university. And again, with colleagues from Epac, we've actually built in what will be a very straightforward verification process of email alerts going out to external people. They verify it, it pings back to the university, we can verify it in-house. So again, with thanks to Epac for a lot of work working with our colleagues to devise a system that was straightforward and quite easy and intuitive to use. And then finally on to the last slide, please. So with the students all having, we hope, a populated e-portfolio with lots of activities on there, in order to leave the ownership with the students, what we did was design in students then choose which activities from their e-portfolio they wish to add to section 6.1 of their electronic here. And 6.1b is, as Rob was saying, there's different sections in the here. This is where information about co- and extracurricular activity is added. So the student chooses what goes into their here. But the only way that that here can be populated is from the My Liverpool e-portfolio. So that's the thread of all three. Something else that's worth mentioning, just based on comments a little bit earlier, is that we were very careful that the student had ownership of the information all the way through. So the student can choose to share their e-portfolio with an academic advisor, with a careers advisor, if they're having a careers discussion, to help inform what have they done, what skills have they developed, etc. And also, once they decide what they want into their here, the students choose again who they wish to share that e-here with, whether they want to send the link to an employer or put it on their LinkedIn profile. It's up to them. And so just the last slide, please. So the summary, we've had the portal, which is here's lots of things. We hope go and join in something. into the e-portfolio. We can give you recognition. Do you realise the skills you're gaining? There is a skills reflection element in the e-portfolio that the students can write for each activity. And then you use that to inform discussions with academic advisors, with careers advisors, and then you choose what best sells yourself in the here. At the moment, we have a summative here produced on graduation, but we're also developing formative heres from the next academic year, so students can develop an interim here to perhaps use when they're applying for year-out placements or anything else like that. So that ends my summary, and I've now got the pleasure of passing on to David Stanbury from the University of Essex, and he's going to talk about the approach that Essex have taken in recognising these activities. So I'll pass over to David.
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Dave Stanbury. I'm Head of Employability at the University of Essex. And building on very much from what Rob said and also from Trish, I'm going to make the point that in terms of the kind of UK situation, whilst there is a general kind of approach and expectation that the sector will provide enhanced transcripts through the here, there's no kind of particular requirement or law that says we have to do it or says that we have to do it in a particular way. And you'll see that we're doing it in a way that has both similarities and differences from the University of Liverpool. So firstly, something just very quickly in terms of context, for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, University of Essex has around 15,000 students. It's a research-intensive university. It's in the top 20 in the UK for its research, and the top 30 overall for those of you who are interested in league tables, which I know obviously is an element of controversy always associated with those. So what I'd like to do, if we can move to the next slide. And so just something very quickly about the kind of background to the institutional journey that we've been on. So Essex had an employability award in 2012, the big Essex Award, which was already doing quite well. And then what we decided to do was to reconfigure that to make it available to a much wider group of students. And this is very much a story about how we've done that, the changes and the trade-offs that we've had to make in order to get a kind of a massified award, and how we then begun to link that into the here, although it is very much a case of begun because we were at the start of that kind of particular journey. So the original award, which we were running with in 2012, was very specific and set in terms of what it could do. So students had to do 50 hours of activity. 8 of those had to include volunteering. They had to attend 2 workshops available from the Careers Open programme of events, and they had to do a very specific form of a sign-off workshop to reflect upon the awards. So it was very highly specified, it was very concrete, and in that sense it was quite kind of restrictive. So what we chose to do in 2015-16 was to move to a very different pattern, where we basically launched a modular approach with a kind of pick and mix stance. The students could pick from a very wide range of units with a view to encompassing a much wider range of activity within the award. The 2012 version had to be completed within an academic year. The current version can roll on from 1, 2, and indeed 3 academic years, and that has its own opportunities and challenges. The sign-off for the award is managed through Career Hub, and that feeds all the data into the here, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. So this is something just a little bit about the kind of the underpinning philosophy and how we're framing our thinking around the use of the award and the higher education achievement and a range of other factors that we do. And I would say for us it's very important that we conceptualize the entire HE experience of one being around the kind of the approach of liberal learning, enabling learners to develop themselves as rounded individuals who can apply their subject understanding, but also their other experiences at university to a range of real world contexts. And that's kind of personal touchstone for me and for my team. We also draw very much upon student development theory and the research set out in a range of books, for example, Pascarella and Terenzini, How College Affects Students, which will be very familiar to, I'm sure, to readers from America, and also a number from in the UK as well. And if you haven't come across that excellent book, which is packed full of excellent research, I would encourage you to buy it and to start leafing through it. And then finally, we're very, very interested in alerting students to the passage of time, the significance of time, and helping them to feel that significance of time as it runs through their fingers whilst they're at university, and thinking, how do I want to make the most of the time that I have? And so time for us is a hugely important dimension, whether we explore that from the perspective of the educational philosopher Dewey, who talks about the moving present and helping people to situate themselves in that moving present, or whether we take a psychological perspective, such as construal level theory, and the tendency to perceive time which is further away or closer away in different ways, and how that impacts upon the decisions that we make. And then finally, if we take a kind of a view from Paulo Freire in terms of thinking about actually how education can illuminate and enlighten students to think creatively in a self-aware way in terms of situating themselves in a particular epoch in time, and how they can consciously rise to meet the challenges. So from all of these kind of three things form part of the backdrop to how we as a service are understanding the importance of enabling students to develop themselves whilst they are at university. We're going to move on to the next slide now, and this is a very much a rapid fire slide, because the new version of the big Essex Award comes at 3 levels: 50 bronze, silver and gold. And for each of those levels, students have to acquire 50 or 100 or 150 points. And each of those points is gained by undertaking a range of units, and units are determined by the amount of hours required to undertake them, 25 hours or thereabouts for a 25-point unit, and so on and so forth. That takes us neatly on to the next slide. As mentioned, the units come in different sizes. We have a choice of over 60 different units that can be undertaken, and they are hugely varied. And they can encompass activity done by student course representatives, ambassadors, people who are acting on the executive capacity for student societies, people who are acting as peer mentors, very broad. So a little bit earlier today, I asked Jasmine Hill, who is our award leader, who sadly, she joined us earlier for today. She now had to go off to collect her kids from school, but I asked her what was the most, perhaps the most unusual award unit that we had. And she reckoned it was an award for what we call at Essex Night Ninjas. And the Night Ninjas are student volunteers who look out for students who are, how should we put it, somewhat worse for wear from nighttime socialising and activities on campus, and they or indeed off campus, and they ensure that students have bottles of water if they are needed of additional kind of hydration, medical support if they need that, or indeed organise for them for a taxi if they need to kind of get safely home. And the Night Ninjas is an award that counts towards our big Essex award. Awards also include paid work that students undertake as well, so hugely varied. In terms of the kind of process for being signed off for those awards, if it's a 25-unit award, students have to reflect upon the skills embedded within that award, and they do that through an online form. And if it's a 50-unit, a 50-point award, students have to reflect upon the skills and write a short reflective statement that talks about the skills they've gained and how that will apply forward to their own employability. It's probably worth saying that both of those forms of hoops that students have to jump through have been set deliberately in a scalable way. It would be possible to imagine activities which are much more rigorous and in-depth, and they have their benefits. But there's a trade-off that we had to strike between the level of rigor and detail and the ability to work with a very large number of students without requiring a huge amount of man hours in order to sign off and check everything that's done. When students have accumulated all the hours, they contact their award verifier, which will be somebody who's been responsible for leading on that particular program. Their award verifier will get a login into Career Hub, and they can see what the students claim to do, and they can affirm that and sign it off, or they can disconfirm it as appropriate. We can now move to the next slide, and we can see how this has played out in terms of the amount of progress across the institution. So the original award, we had 500 students involved in the activity, and at the end of the first year, 300 completed. We were able then to increase that in the subsequent year. In the first year of doing the new award, we were able to double the number of students who were involved and double the number of students who completed it. And in the current year, we have over 3,000 students who have signed up to take part, but because this is the kind of the still very early stages, we're not sure how that's going to play out in terms of the numbers of students who actually complete the bronze, silver and gold award, because now they have a longer time frame. They may have a lesser sense of urgency. Coming back to the issue of time, they may have a less sense of urgency, and that may impact upon the speed with which they make progress through the different elements of the award. What we'll now move is to the next slide, which is the penultimate slide. And this talks about how we have linked the award into the HERE. So we have used this as the opportunity to replace what was a further education, further achievement transcript, which was a bit like a kind of proto version of the HERE, with a full version of the HERE, which corresponds to the national standards that we have. So all of the extracurricular activities now go into section 6.1 of the HERE and have to go through the big Essex award. They have to count towards the award in order to show up. So we use it institutionally to drive engagement with the employability award, to drive engagement with the career service as well. And that seems to be working, and that provides us with one route to getting everything onto the HERE. The process we've taken at the University of Essex has not been dissimilar to the one set out by Trish at the University of Liverpool, where we've met with registry, we've met with a range of stakeholders, we formed committees, we've carefully looked at all the different kind of things that might go in, we set criteria, and through a really quite detailed and consensual process, we've decided what will kind of meet the requirements and go on to the HERE. A point of difference from the approach being taken at Liverpool is that our default option is that everything that goes into the HERE, everything that goes into the Big Essex Award will count towards the HERE unless the student specifically requests it not to do so. We're aware of particular situations in which a student might feel sensitive about their information and not want to share that with everyone. So we have a kind of an escape lane route that students can activate, but otherwise we expect everything to go in. So we try to keep this administratively very straightforward, so there is no question about what will show up on that official university documentation. Okay, if we move to the next last slide. So I want just to say a little bit about how this has played out institutionally, and what I think have been some of the benefits and the drivers. So firstly, we very much wanted to provide a much detailed, more richer and more granular picture of the range of activities and skills that students are gathering, particularly at the co and extracurricular level. We wanted to provide a very rigorous process for recognising those skills, and as part of that process to be able to pitch a wider tent, as it were, that includes a range of activities which might not otherwise have been officially recognised by the university. And a nice example is the programme we have, which is a Challenge Essex programme, which is running for its second year now, where students, as an extracurricular activity, have to work together for 3 days and intensively to work as groups to solve and address global challenges as they impinge locally upon the student population, and that counts toward, has its own award, and is the kind of thing that we've been able to encompass within the award in a very visible way that's valued by the entire university. And through those two steps, we've aimed to incentivise students to undertake the steps required to do more things to develop themselves through employability. We've used the modular approach to make it possible to work with a range of stakeholders across the university to say, if you're doing something that you think develops students' employability, create a unit award with us, work with us to ensure that's wrapped up into a neat, solid, substantial bundle, and then we'll put that on offer to students so they can gain award for things that they may have done otherwise, but also to encourage them to go further and say, okay, I've got that unit, how can I add on additional building blocks to make a kind of fuller portfolio to offer to employers? This is the first year where students are going to get a summative award as they graduate, so naturally we're very excited about that. And that has required really, really close working with registry, with the SU and with other stakeholders, again, which has been an advantage, putting everyone on the same page in terms of how we think about employability skills. It's going to be therefore the first year that we use a formative here, and we link that in with personal tutors and other activities. But for us, this is very, very much feels like kind of Everest base camp. So we've got so far. There is much, much further we need to go in terms of thinking about how do we bring personal tutors on, how do we share that with careers advisors. We don't have a neat portfolio, and that's something that we will be thinking about at Essex over the coming years. And so naturally, I'll be keen to talk to Trish and to other people. I've come across Pebble Pad before, and I'm sure that's one of the ones that we will be considering. So that's where we are. It's the start of a journey. We managed to engage more students as a result of it, and our work now is to really maximise the benefits for students going forward. So that's me, Dan from the University of Essex. Thank you very much, and I hope you found that kind of helpful presentation.
Thank you so much, David. There was one question that came in, and that was, so what if the students complete activities towards the BEA but don't fully complete enough hours for the award? Are the activities still listed on the here?
Okay, that is one of those questions that it would be absolutely fantastic if Jasmine was still here in order to answer that. So I think probably the best thing is I'm going to pass on that, but we can provide an update which will be authoritative, and we'll nail that subsequently.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, David. So again, thank you so much to Kathy and Trish and David, as well as Rob, on these great presentations and really providing this wonderful overview of sort of the diversity in projects that are happening both here in the United States as well as in the UK. I just wanted to provide a few summarizing comments before turning it over to Rob to help us think about what the next steps might be. And I guess just maybe 3 brief points. I think there were many sort of ideas that came up as part of the discussion. I think there were comments in the chat about really seeing what the overlap and the connections are between the work that's happening really in both of our countries. And I guess first, I really appreciate David's comments about this idea of thinking about what that theoretical framework. I mean, we're creating, these new kinds of records, thinking about new ways of representing student learning. David mentioned Pascarella and Teranzini's How College Affects Students. Certainly some of the work that Kathy's thinking about around student engagement draws on a large body of literature there. I think we all sort of draw upon John Dewey's work around, active experiential learning. And of course, reflection is a big component of all the work that we're doing as well. The second issue is sort of this question about verification and validation. Who's verifying this work? Who's validating the kind of learning that's happening? Certainly, we're all sort of very interested in this idea about, the co-curricular, extracurricular experience. And how do we measure that? How do we capture it in such a way that we can recognize that as a unique part of the students' experiences on our respective campuses? And then I think thirdly, I think this sort of came up and appropriately as sort of a secondary but very important component is this: how do we partnership with our technology, vendors and so on? I mean, certainly the technology has continued to advance. The reason why we're able to move from a paper sort of record to a digital record is because the technology makes that possible. And how do we continue to partner with them as well? I think the last comment I have is around this question of shelf life. And this came from my colleague, Amelia Parnell, who is with the NASPA Student Affairs Professionals Organization. As we think about these kinds of records, what is the shelf life? Particularly, you know, for students who are maybe just recently graduated, that diploma, that transcript does have quite a bit of value. But as they go, you know, 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, as they're, you know, changing positions, finding out new jobs, taking on jobs that currently don't even exist, you know, how do we create records that really help support them through their lifelong learning career, lifelong, life-wide learning career, as Rob would also say. So I think, again, I really appreciate everyone's sort of contributions today. We certainly welcome your continued sort of ideas in the chat, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rob to talk about what the next steps might be following up on this webinar.
Thanks ever so much, Helen, and thanks also to you for co-leading this. I mean, an anxiety, I think, colleagues, is we've got 7 minutes left, and there are about 40 of us on the call still, and the chances are then you all get 3 seconds each to say something. But I wonder if what we ought to do is, first of all, recognize that there are a number of issues that people have raised that we haven't dealt with. Ruth's just raised an issue about evaluation, about impact, I guess, also, and about evidence that we've got that how students to take to this kind of engagement. And Connie earlier on raised an issue about, I guess, about audience and who controls the data and how that data is presented and may be seen. And Trish has got one kind of answer to that, and David had a slightly different answer, which is in terms of what goes into the document that the institution issues. So it seems to me there are some emerging agenda items. Kevin's just raising a point about validation in the chat. That we might want to pick up, that we've kind of skated along the surface, and I don't apologize for that because I think we needed to do it, and I think it's been a really interesting chunk of time, and I thank Helen and Kathy and Trish and Dave for that. But I do wonder about just thinking now for a minute or two about some strategies for going forwards. And I think there are a couple that maybe we ought to be engaging in, and I have an anxiety. A couple I think we ought to be doing is I think we ought to be sharing the recording, which Helen I know is going to do, and maybe setting up some resources which give you, I don't know, 10 things to go to for the work in the UK and the work in the US, if that seems sensible. So you don't have to trail around everywhere. It's all in one place. And if you want somewhere to start, that's the place to start. And the other thing, and I think, and that relies on you as much as us, is for us collectively to use something like a Google Doc, and I'm not precious about that, it doesn't matter what it is, to get to grips with the what next question. So I almost want to invite you, before you stop doing this and switch to something else, and in the case of the UK colleagues, go home, and in the case of the US colleagues, get really started on the day's work, and in the case of anybody who's around from Australia, go back to bed. I want you just to think about what's this stimulated in you. I think there are some issues, there are some jagged edges. We've kind of all talked about work in progress, and we're all in that process. And I think if we can take this forwards with some issues for working on, that would be brilliant. What we probably don't want to do is have another webinar that's simply presentational like we've done today, though that's taken a year to get organized. So that's where I'm up to. I think I'd like anybody to say anything about that as a proposition, partly because I just invented it, and partly because we need to, I would like to think this isn't an oasis in the desert, but it's actually part of a flowing stream that takes us forwards to, I don't know where. I'll shut up.
So, John, do you have any other comments or thoughts?
Well, we'll keep the chat open, and I think that was a great sort of challenge for us, Rob. We needed an opportunity to hear so many exciting things going on, and there wasn't a presentation where I didn't say, well, could you really tell me how that worked out and what's happening? And I think we're at a critical time for us to be working on both sides of the pond and around the globe. So we'll keep the chat open. We are reaching near our end time. So Mike, if you could advance the slide. We would like to or might get the slide. There we go. Put a promotion in for our Aaeebl conference. The Aaeebl conference will be this summer in Portland, Oregon, July 24th through 27th. Hopefully we'll have a number of webinars before that, but that will be an opportunity for people to see individuals larger than a thumbnail on a screen. What I'd like to do is advance to the next slide and say this was a really first step here, where we had a joint presentation between the Center for Recorded Achievement, Aaeebl, and Epac. And I think it was a wonderful first venture, and I hope that we'll continue to do these. We want to thank everyone who participated by presenting about the exciting things they're doing on their campuses. We really want to thank everyone who attended the webinar, because having the chat and the comments really has enriched the presentations and added to have more things to think about. And shortly we'll be posting the video, and other resources from this will be appearing either in Aaeebl or at the Center for Recording Achievement. So with that, our particular thanks to Rob and Helen, who were the ringleaders on this, and it did take you a while to wrangle it down. But before we sign off, do you have any last comments for Rob and Helen? From Rob or Helen?
Just from my point of view, to add to the Aaeebl event by saying that we're planning the CRA here annual seminar for a couple of months' time, and I'm pinching most of the title from this webinar to describe that seminar. So that's going to be in the UK. It's going to be in Manchester. I'll promise you a day that it won't rain. That's really an unusual promise. That's probably the biggest promise I've made today. But we'll post information about that, and we'll post evidence of what happens in that for people to pick up from wherever you are. Thanks very much, John. Thank you to Helen. Thanks to all the contributors.
And I just want to add my thanks again to Rob, all the presenters, and especially to John as well as Michael for really making sure everything worked on the back end and made everything go so smoothly. Again, we appreciate your participation. Aaeebl will actually, together with Epac, we'll be hosting some additional meetups in the coming months, and so we'll definitely be providing more information about that as well via the Aaeebl as well as the Epac website. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your evening, day, afternoon, night, whatever it might be. Thank you.